With October coming to a close and November right around the corner, it means the very first college football playoff rankings are right on the horizon. Those are going to be released after this weekend's games on Tuesday. And there is a great scenario, there is a perfect scenario, there is a best case scenario as far as the postseason goes for the Big Ten. Let's go around the top of this big nation.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
Some fan bases may absolutely love this. Other fan bases may absolutely hate this. But there is a scenario out there for the Big Ten that exists for the Big Ten championship game and for the college football playoff that can get those 4 Big Ten teams into the college football playoff, and that can possibly get 3 Big Ten teams to the Final Four, to the semifinals of the college football playoff as well. Now, where do we start with all of this? We got to start with the Big Ten's version of the postseason. We got to start in Indianapolis. We got to start with the Big Ten championship game. There is a possibility, in fact, there is a probability that no matter which way, whether it's a combination of Ohio State, Indiana, Penn State, and Oregon, whatever combination that goes, this is going to be the biggest Big Ten championship game in the history of that matchup. And as long as we're on that track, let's make it the biggest and the baddest. Let's make it undefeated versus undefeated. 12-0 versus 12-0, 9-0 in conference versus 9-0 in conference, number 1 versus number 2. This would be the game of conference championship weekend. The best case scenario, I believe, for the conference championship game is a new matchup, one that we haven't seen this season. The number 1 team in the Oregon Ducks, and I would have the Penn State Nittany Lions as the number 2 team. In this scenario, this includes Penn State getting over the hump. This includes James Franklin getting a big win over Ohio State this weekend and then running the table the rest of the way to go undefeated. Right now, Penn State is the number 3 team in the country behind a 1-loss Georgia. If Penn State is able to get this win over the Buckeyes and be undefeated with that type of win on their resume, I think that can certainly vault them over a 1-loss Georgia, a Georgia team that lost to Alabama earlier this season. This would be a win, like how Georgia was able to beat Texas. This is a similar win for Penn State, being able to beat Ohio State, and they're undefeated Georgia with 1 loss. I think in the very first college football playoff committee rankings, that could put the Nittany Lions at number 2 in the country. I'm sure that ESPN would love to reveal the rankings with 2 Big Ten teams sitting at number 1 and number 2, and if they win out the rest of the way, this puts the Big Ten championship game on a different level. Now, what does having number 1 versus number 2, that's great, but what does having these teams undefeated and in this specific spot and in this specific scenario really guarantee for the Big Ten Conference? First of all, it guarantees that the winner of this game on that first Saturday in December in Indianapolis receives the number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff. And for those 4 seeds, of course, that's the one that you want to be in that creates the most favorable path to the Final Four, to the college football playoff semifinals. And it also basically guarantees, I know there's a lot of scenarios that you could throw out there, but it basically guarantees that the runner-up in Indianapolis gets that coveted number 5 seed. The team that would play the number 12, which is likely the Group of 5 champion, which is likely right now the Boise State Broncos. And then in the next round, in the quarterfinals, you would play the lowest of the top 4 conference champions, which is likely going to be the Big 12. Somebody like an Iowa State, somebody like a BYU or a Colorado or a Kansas State. We all know the Big 12 could cannibalize itself and really could be very interesting here down the stretch to see who gets that number 4 seed. So you take on the G5 champion, you take on the Big 12 champion, and then you get a possible rematch between Oregon and Penn State, or whichever Big Ten teams match up in the Big Ten championship game. That's why this scenario really works in terms of the college football playoff bracket. Now, Ohio State versus Oregon, that would the rematch, the revenge factor, all of that would be great. But I think that this Penn State game and this Oregon versus Penn State matchup, a new matchup, would bring a lot of intrigue. And there's no guarantee in those situations that I just laid out, the number 1 seed and the number 5 seed, that a one-loss Ohio State would lock up the Big Ten to the number 1 seed and the number 5 seed as well. So I think both teams being undefeated, number 1 and number 2 in the country, really sets up a great situation, and for the Big Ten to be in those 2 coveted spots as the number 1 and the number 5 seed in the college football playoff. How about Oregon's explosiveness versus Penn State's creativity? That is a matchup in Indianapolis that is ultra intriguing. The Big Ten championship game of the past that really only would compete somewhat in this space. Remember 2015 when you had number 5 Michigan State go up against number 4 Iowa in Indianapolis. The winner of that one was going to punch their ticket to the 4-team college football playoff. I think that there are some similarities now being a 12-team playoff. Both of these teams are able to still be able to compete for a national championship, but I think this one brings the most smoke for the Big Ten and guarantees some really good spots in that 12-team tournament at the end of the year. Now, you have those 2 teams at the top that really slide into those spots in terms of the 12-team playoff. Now, there are other teams. There are 2 other teams to talk about as far as the at-large spots in the playoff, and how would this all go down? Ohio State sits there at 10-2. So they got losses by 1 point to Oregon, let's say a 1-possession loss to Penn State. That's as good of a number 3 option in a conference that you can ask for. Maybe one of the most talented teams in the country in Ohio State. In the latter half of the season, they would have a win against a ranked Indiana team. More on them here in just a minute, as you see on the graphic there. And they would be able to finally be able to beat the Michigan Wolverines at the end of the season, which I think would do a lot for their mentality and their mindset going into this postseason, going into this college football playoff. Folks, you can't leave out an 11-1 Big Ten team. An Indiana team, if their only loss on the schedule is to a fellow playoff team in the Ohio State Buckeyes, the way that they're beating teams and boat racing teams and how impressive that some of these wins are, I know they're not against ranked teams. I know that they're not the strongest schedule or the strongest teams in the world, but Indiana is winning and winning big and winning impressively. You cannot leave an 11-1 Hoosiers plain and simple out of the college football playoff. If the playoffs started today, Indiana would be one of the first couple of teams, based on the AP poll, Indiana would be one of the first couple of teams sitting on the outside looking in. You look at the teams ahead of IU right now, there is a lot of potential for these teams that have 2 losses. There's a lot of potential for teams in front of the Hoosiers right now to lose and for Indiana to certainly move ahead of them. Tennessee has to play Kentucky. They have to play Georgia. They have to play Vanderbilt. Texas A&M has to play Texas. Notre Dame has to play at USC. Clemson has to play at Pitt, at Virginia Tech, and a possible ACC championship game. Iowa State plays 5-3 Texas Tech. They play 5-3 Cincinnati, and they play their rival Kansas State at the end of the year. So there's going to be a lot of potential for Indiana, certainly, to rise up in the rankings. Let's talk about seeding. Now, a 10-2 Ohio State team, I believe, would be going up against and really battling for that number 6 seed with the loser of the SEC championship game. If Texas and Georgia are sitting at 11-1 apiece going into Atlanta, I think the loser of that game probably slides into the number 6 seed if we're being realistic about this. But the best case scenario, which is what this is all about, I think the best case scenario is for Ohio State to try to be that number 6 seed. Maybe we get some chaos a little bit in the SEC, and the loser of that game has 3 losses. If the Buckeyes can lock in that number 6 seed, you get an 11 seed, one of the lowest seeds in this 12-team tournament, and then you likely play the ACC champion in the quarterfinals, whether that's Miami or whether that's Clemson. I think that's a very favorable path for the Ohio State Buckeyes to get to the semifinals. So the 6th seed, I think, is the best case. Likely in this scenario is probably the number 7 seed, and they would have to play the SEC champion in the quarterfinal. Regardless, I think having a team like Ohio State on the other side of the bracket from the Oregon Ducks and the Penn State Nittany Lions, I think presents the Big Ten an opportunity to get a third team into these semifinals. Let's talk about the Indiana Hoosiers. Okay, so I think the committee is going to agree. I think I agree. You cannot allow an 11-1 Big Ten team to be on the outside looking in. That being said, they would get in. I'm just not sure how highly seeded they would be. Their most impressive wins would probably be against Michigan and Nebraska at that point in time. Of course, the loss to Ohio State. In reality, Indiana might be sitting somewhere around a double-digit seed at the number 10 seed, at the number 11 seed. But if we get teams ahead of them that are losing, you get a majority of these teams that have 2 losses when all is said and done. I think the best-case scenario for the Indiana Hoosiers in the college football playoff would be able to get up to that number 9 seed and play the number 8 seed Notre Dame Fighting Irish. To have an in-state battle, your fans don't have to travel far to get up to South Bend for that game. I think that this is an Indiana team. I know that's a good Notre Dame defense, but I think that this is an Indiana team that could go toe-to-toe with Notre Dame. And if they were able to beat Notre Dame in the first round of the playoff, that sets up an Oregon-Indiana quarterfinal, which guarantees a Big Ten team to get into the semifinal, whether it is the Ducks or whether it is the Hoosiers. So Ducks 1, Nittany Lions 5, Buckeyes 6 or 7, and then Indiana sitting there at number 9 or maybe number 10 or number 11. You look at that across this country, across this college football playoff, I think that is as good of a scenario as you can get right now for the Big Ten Conference. Those are my thoughts. I want to know your thoughts, folks. It is playoff time. I have been excited for this time for a long period of time. It is going to be so exciting, the push to the postseason. What is your best scenario? Leave all that in the comments below. I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching and listening to Big Nation. Make sure to subscribe and follow Big Ten Ted on X, YouTube, and podcast platforms to stay in the know on all things Big Ten football.